Well, hello everyone. Wa gozaimasu. Welcome to World History video number 2 on imperialism and resistance. I'm Mr. Levy, and I'm very excited to be here, and I'm looking forward to chatting with you and working through this next section in our semester. So, as you guys know, I assigned an article to you yesterday to read and answer some questions about. It was titled Imperialism and Resistance Shape the Modern World. It was a Newsella article, and I know that a number of you might have been a little concerned because it was around 7 pages long. So all I want to do in this video is really quickly go over the beginning of the article, talk about how you can look at what is being presented to make sure you can answer number 1 of the 3 questions I assigned. So number 1 is, in a paragraph, analyze the reasons for 19th century imperialism. So I want to go and look at the article and make sure you can identify 5 specific reasons that 19th century imperialism really grew and expanded. Um, so without further ado, I want to keep this short and sweet. Let's get started. So if you don't have the article in front of you, I've got it up on the screen. Um, Now, with any article, first thing we do before we get into it is we want to read the title and look at, see what we can learn from it. Now, unfortunately, I don't have my awesome Promethean board, my best friend in the world. I only have this little pointer here on my screen, so I'm going to use that to kind of direct you to what I'm talking about as we go through this. So first off, article title, Imperialism and Resistance Shape the Modern World. The first question I might want to ask myself is, do I really know what imperialism is? And if I answer, or the answer that I might have is, nah, I've got some questions, then I'm going to Google it and see what I get. And the first definition on Google isn't really that bad. It's essentially imperialism is the process by which a nation or a country might expand its power and influence either through military strength or diplomacy. So imperialism is really the process by which countries, nations expand their power over others. Um, and if we look at the second term, resistance, that's pretty self-explanatory. These are people who are probably resisting this process of others expanding their power. So we have imperialism resistance and how it shapes the modern world. When we think of the modern world, no, let's take a guess and think maybe this is all happening in the late 1800s and how it impacts us, impacted us in the 20th century. Let's try that. What's the next thing we got? Well, we got a picture. This is pretty cool. We have this European looking fellow with a big gun with a bunch of his buddies around standing atop a dead elephant. Not too cool. Like elephants, awesome animals. We just had a baby one at the Tucson Zoo a few days ago. Hooray for us. So I think here you have a picture that reflects what Europeans might have been doing during this age of imperialism, essentially going into other areas and using their advanced technology and weapons to take advantage of the natural resources. Um, you also have some people in the background who do not look European and do not look very thrilled about this entire activity. So a portrayal of the topic at hand. So let's get into it. So rather than read the whole article, which you can do on your own, I just want to key you to some key points that are brought up. The first 6 paragraphs, as you read through them, and I anticipate what I would like you to do, is to break these apart the way you always do with an article, that is underlining the main ideas, circling any terms you don't know, and defining them as you go through. Looking at this, at the beginning, the authors refer to some earlier examples of colonization. Specifically in this second article, they talk about how the Spanish conquered a number of parts of the world for God, gold, and glory. And we spent a lot of time talking about this, specifically with the Aztecs and, those three G's that Spanish were going after. So they refer to that, and that's good. That's something we know about. And then they talk about how this process of colonization actually sped up and got bigger. So we want to ask ourselves, okay, why did it get bigger? What was going on? They then break down in these three fairly large paragraphs exactly what they're going to talk about in the whole article. They're going to talk about um, changes in the economy, how industrialization had grown. We know about that. That's good. Um, the fact that this was now expanding worldwide, it was going on globally, and that the colonizers were now going farther into areas that they were colonizing instead of just saying on the coasts. Okay. And then also the really strong impact this increased colonization, imperialism really had on the people who lived there. Okay, fair enough. So why did this happen? These are questions they're going to answer in the article. That's what we want to talk about in our questions too. So very good. In this paragraph, there's a really important point that I want to bring up in this guy right here. And that is basically um, that this, like all subjects in history, is complicated. They're going to talk about reasons why imperialism and countries expanded, but it's not always the same for every country that's expanding their imperial power or every country that's being colonized. Each place, each time is different. Some people were opposed to colonialism on both sides, the colonists and the colonizers, or the colonized, and some people were for it. So there's no simple black and white portrayal of this period and this situation. There's a whole lot of gray. So we always want to keep that in mind whenever we look at history, especially with something as complex as the imperial era. All right, let's get into specifics. So we get to our first section in the article, and the heading is Economic and Political Changes Help Bringing About Colonization. Fair enough. We get that. We know that we're going to have economic and policies covered and politics covered in this section. Let's make sure we understand them so we can include that in our response to question one. The first thing they're going to talk about in these first pretty much four paragraphs is how industrialism drove increased expansion, colonization, and imperialism. This is something we know. We understand industrialization. We understand that in Europe, factories being started growing, and European countries started taking raw materials, and let's use cotton as an example, used machines to turn that cotton into cloth, and then other machines to turn that cloth into clothing. And so that was that process of manufacturing that industrialization, the Industrial Revolution started. Well, that kept growing. And by the time that we're talking about, and we're really looking at 1850 to 1914, that industrialization had really expanded throughout much of Europe, into the United States, and even into Japan. So the first cause for this increase in imperialism, and this is the first thing you want to mention in your answer, was that industrialization had expanded and European countries, along with the United States and Japan, needed more raw materials and more markets to sell the things they made to. So basically, let's take the mills in England. As those mills in England grew, those factories, they would take cotton, turn it into cloth, turn that cloth into clothing, and maybe sell that to people in England. Well, pretty soon they found that they needed more and more cotton, more than they currently had access to, And they had already sold all the cloth they could sell to the people in England, so they needed more people to buy it. So basically, this growth in industrialization meant Europeans and Americans and the Japanese had to keep going out and finding new areas that had more raw materials and also markets where they could sell the stuff they produce. So they talk about that here. They use a gentleman from France who's making that argument that this is what should happen. Um, an example would be England eventually will go out and colonize the country that is now India. India produces a huge amount of cotton. England took the cotton that they got from India, they put it into their mills back in England, they produced cloth and clothing, and they essentially then forced the government of India that they had placed there to buy this cloth and materials from the British. So you had this nice circle of productivity for England that made them wealthier and wealthier and stronger and stronger. The Indians, on the other hand, had mixed feelings about this. Some of them were okay with it, a lot of them were not. So that's just one example. Okay, so cause number one or reason number one, increased industrialization. Great. So another element that they talk about here, and they use these examples, concrete examples of people from that time making an argument, is that right here in this paragraph, the gentleman is talking about how the European races are essentially superior to the races that they are colonizing. And so this is used to justify taking over other places and peoples to make your own country wealthier. So the second reason that imperialism was undertaken, and it's a complicated one, is racism. Europeans, Americans, and the Japanese all felt they were justified in doing this because they were racially superior and the other people in other parts of the world were inferior. So number two, racism. Another thing that they then talk about next is religion. So they refer to a gentleman, Dr. Livingston, who's very well known, and you've got these three paragraphs here are him speaking about the importance of bringing Christianity to other parts of the world that are being colonized. Um, the language is very difficult. It's from the 19th century, but in essence, he is just saying that it is critical to bring both religion and the economy to these other parts of the world to help civilize them, to help make them more than they are, to lift them up. And this becomes a very important justification for this imperialism. For the authors here, in this paragraph, they basically ask the question, are people like Ferry and Livingston trying to make imperialism more than just money, to make it about religion and racial superiority as a way to motivate people? That could likely be an answer. So that's your third cause, or your third reason that factors into why imperialism grew. It was justified by religion. So we've got three reasons that imperialism grew. Let's look quickly at number four. Um, in this paragraph now at the top of the screen, the authors refer to how Great Britain, England, and France were two rapidly growing imperial powers. Well, what happens when your neighbors start becoming stronger imperial powers? Are the countries next to them think, hey, we can't let that happen. We, because we're just as good as they are, need to compete and also grow. So the example they use is a gentleman from Germany making this argument, saying we Germans are just as good as the French and the British. So let's go and get our own colonies. And this is true around the world. Every country that could in this environment started trying to become a colonizer, started trying to become more industrialized, started trying to get a stronger military and started trying to use their stronger military and diplomatic efforts to expand their power for one key reason. They would rather be colonizers than the colonized. And this is true for Germany, and this is, in a way, and true for countries like Italy. But it was especially true for the country of Japan. They went through a radical change in their society in the late 1800s. It's called the Meiji Ishin, and what they did was they industrialized. They became a world power by defeating the Russians in a war, and then they began to go out and colonize other parts of Asia. And they used justifications of racial superiority, and they didn't use religion so much, but also that they were bringing a more enlightened way of life to others in this effort to colonize. So, long story short, the fourth thing after industrialization, racism, religion was, you could say, nationalism or competition, the desire to not fall behind, the desire to be a colonizer rather than a colonized country. So those are four reasons they talked about. And the last thing they mentioned before we go to the next section, which we're not going to cover tonight, is they had all these ambitions, the Europeans, the Americans, and the Japanese. But how could they actually do this? Well, one of the reasons is they had better weapons. They had better technology. And while we saw the industrial age starting early on and, back in the 1700s, by the middle 1800s, it had the ability to manufacture and produce advanced weaponry had grown by leaps and bounds. So when the Europeans set out to conquer areas in Africa, in Asia, in North and South America, it was very difficult for the inhabitants of those countries to resist. And the example that they give here in the bottom is an example of a battle in Africa, or an effort by the British to conquer a large region in Africa, where the locals resisted and lost 11,000 soldiers, whereas the British only lost 40. So that kind of takes us up through the last reason why this imperialism grew. Advances in weapons and technology allowed it. And that pretty much takes us to the end of what I want to cover tonight. So once again, I'm trying to do this so you don't feel overwhelmed by the article. That first question in a paragraph, analyze the reasons for 19th century imperialism. We've covered 5: industrialization, racism, religion, nationalism or competition, and improved technology and weaponry. Those are all things you want to describe in your response to paragraph 1 or question 1. You probably want to identify or define, like, at least give at least one sentence to each of those issues, if not more. And you don't have to limit yourself to a paragraph. Just show me you understand. And again, like all our writing, the more you can go in and give supporting details from the text, actual examples that show me you read and understood what you were reading, awesome, even better. Okay, so that's it for tonight. So this week, there's only 4 days this week, no school on Friday. All I want you to do is read this article. Hopefully you watch this video all the way through. Watch the next one. We're going to do the same thing with questions 2 and 3. That way you can feel confident about writing your responses to those 3 questions. You can put all of them in one text, one response, and email or text or get it to me. You guys know the deal. So I really appreciate you guys sitting through this. I hope you're doing well. Can't wait to get back in the classroom and hang out with y'all. And I hope you have a good one. We'll talk again soon. Bye-bye.